Hello, welcome to another Q&A about history of science and technology. Let's see, we have a bunch of questions saved up here. One from Eli. What's an interesting big picture discovery associated with this recent minimal model for biological evolution that I've been studying? Eli asks that answers questions about Darwin's natural selection. How does it change the narrative? Okay, well, let's start talking about a little bit of history. I mean, the question is, people see all these critters in the world, all these different animals and plants and all this kind of thing. By the time of Linnaeus, there was a sort of fairly systematic classification. Even in ancient Greek times, people like Aristotle had made, lists of types of organisms and had tried to classify them in this way and that way. So lots of different kinds of organisms. Where did the species come from? Where did all these different kinds of organisms come from? And people didn't know. And sort of a possible theory was the world was just created this way. And there's never been any new species produced. It's just these are the species that always existed. Now, I think, by the 1830s, people were beginning to realize there were fossils, there were even dinosaur fossils, things like this. It's like there've been species that were around at one time that aren't here now. I think earlier fossils, people had certainly known about fossils forever. Earlier fossils, it's like, well, it's a kind of mollusk or something like this. And it's like, well, okay, that mollusk isn't there today, but that mollusk might have been there, even 1,000 years ago or something, and got fossilized into the rocks. But by the time you're seeing these dinosaurs in rocks, it's pretty clear that it's pretty unlikely there are dinosaurs running around. By the early 1800s, enough of the world had been explored that it was pretty unlikely that there were dinosaurs running around somewhere on the Earth, and that must have come from a much earlier time. But I think that was kind of one realization. Then this idea of kind of the progression of species, even Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had a bunch of thinking about sort of the progression of species and the idea of, some species are kind of connected to others, and you could kind of see, this thing seemed to follow, turn into that thing, and so on. It's a little bit reminiscent, I suppose, of what happened with things like continental drift, where people had noticed that if you make puzzle pieces out of South America and Africa, the kind of South America sort of fits into the side of Africa, so to speak. And then it said, well, maybe that was because they used to be joined up and so on. But it was sort of a pseudo amateur theory. And I think there were similar things with sort of animals and plants and so on. It kind of looks like this sort of goes with that. There were all kinds of different things that were said. I mean, there's a chap called William Paley who, what was his book called? I don't know, something about vestiges of creation, but it was a book about natural theology. It was in the mid 1800s, kind of a revealing kind of the will of the creator, so to speak, in the pattern of plants and animals on the earth. And I think that's where the kind of concept came about, that you look at an animal or something and you dissect it. I'm way too squeamish to ever do that, but one can. You see that there's just a lot of complicated stuff going on inside the organism. And so Paley, for example, made the argument, well, if you see a pocket watch lying on the ground and you look inside the pocket watch, it's pretty complicated. And you know that was made by a creator, a human creator. Now you look at an animal, it's even more complicated inside. Surely that must have been made by a creator of superhuman ability, so to speak. And that was sort of used as a kind of theological argument for, therefore, the species must have had their origin in the work of God, so to speak, something sort of beyond humans as a source for sort of the complexity of biological organisms. Okay, so into all of that came Charles Darwin by 1859 when he wrote Origin of Species. he'd kind of traveled the world on the Beagle and things like this, and had observed these different species. And I think he certainly claimed that the big kind of realization came in the Galapagos Islands, where there are multiple islands, and there are different kinds of birds, finches, that exist on those islands, and they all seemed like they come from the same origin, but yet you could see on one island they needed to crack open fruit in this way, on another island that, and they'd ended up evolving different shapes of beaks and so on. And so Darwin then came up with this idea of origin of species and natural selection, so to speak, the concept that there would be a progressive change in species over time, and that what ended up being the structure of a particular species will be determined by natural selection, by the environment, making some variants of the species be more successful, have more offspring than others. And he realized that as a sort of a necessary, almost mathematical fact, by the time if you have sort of random mutations to an organism, and some of those mutations are more successful, lead to more offspring, it's inevitably the case that assuming that that's sort of a heritable trait, that the trait that leads to more offspring will eventually become dominant of the population. And so then Darwin's implication from that was that all the complexity in the organisms that we see was somehow sculpted by this process of natural selection. It was not put there by the hand of God, so to speak. It was the result of kind of continual effect of the environment on the species, making the species perfectly tuned for its environment. And that insofar as species were highly complex, it was because that complexity was somehow needed to achieve to maximize the fitness, to get the most offspring, to be as successful as possible in the environment, complicated as it is, that's presented by the world. So kind of Darwin's idea was natural selection and the effect of the environment carefully sculpts organisms and somehow leads them to be as complicated as they are. Now, I think Darwin didn't think he'd really solved that problem. But famously, he says in the very last sentence of The Origin of Species, he says something like, as the Earth goes on circling around the sun according to the fixed law of gravity, so new species have been and are being created, ever more complex, more or less he says, ever more complex, I think, leading eventually, I think he says, to the creation of the higher animals. That means folks like us. So his concept was that there was some fundamental law of biology and of natural selection, of this process of evolution, that inevitably led to, in effect, more and more complex forms being created. Now, I think that he never really nailed that down, and nor did anybody since. It's really been something where people have said, well, we can describe, how this population increases relative to that one. We can describe how this, you can have certain ratios of the number of males and females in the species because of this characteristic, and so on and so on and so on. But the question of why there are more complex organisms really hadn't been answered. And it's even the question of, well, what is the most successful organism going to be? I mean, we humans have been doing okay, but could there just be some little, bacterium that comes along that's much simpler organism in some respects, that just takes over the planet, wipes us out, takes over the planet? We can't prove that's not possible. It's the fact that sort of the organisms like us are kind of, in some sense, more complex. We have more organs, we have more sort of functional features that we can recognize in us than the sort of more primitive little creatures have, so to speak. But it's like, if you look in, I don't know, a mollusk or something, it doesn't have, it doesn't have thermoregulation. It's not warm-blooded. It doesn't have a backbone with all of the kind of nervous system that goes with that. I don't think it has much of an adaptive immune system. These are all kind of functional ideas that sort of got introduced as one went to further in the course of evolution. Okay, so the thing that I started off doing in the 1980s and failed to get done at that time was trying to understand more about the foundations of sort of what might lead to complexity in biology. Why does biological evolution even work? Why is it the case that you can find decent solutions to problems of surviving in the environment and so on by just tweaking the genome, by just making single point mutations? Why isn't it the case that you can't get there from here, so to speak? It could be that yes, there is a solution to living in the deep ocean or something, but in order to get to that solution, you have to figure it out once and for all. In other words, you couldn't, if you want to build an airplane, let's say, it's very unlikely. In our experience with the engineering, you don't start off with a piece of a glider and a this and a that and the other, and make incremental changes, and then and you sort of incrementally let the thing get off the ground. Instead, the Wright brothers and so on had to make a bunch of inventions all together, so to speak, to have the thing really work. And so it's not obvious that you can win in biological evolution, win in, as Darwin called it, the struggle for life, by making sort of purely incremental changes. But of course, what we now know, now that we understand that there's DNA and genomics, and there's a separate sort of genetic program for an organism, separate from what the organism develops into, and the thing on which the mutations are happening is that genome. And that genome, you can make a tiny change in the genome and end up with a pretty big change in the phenotype, the final kind of form of the organism after it's grown and developed. So the thing that we now realize, which Darwin didn't know, is that sort of life is a very computational kind of phenomenon, where one is dealing with this sort of program-like genome that for us humans is 6 billion base pairs, and that one is then taking that program and essentially building the organism. Every individual organism is built according to that program. So the thing I got interested in, as I say, I started to try to do this in the mid-1980s and didn't manage to make it work at that time, was to just say, if we take very, very tiny programs and we make mutations in those programs, can we get those programs to progressively adapt to satisfy certain fitness criteria? Well, when I tried doing this in the 1980s, I didn't push it that hard, and my programs didn't do anything interesting. Coming back to that earlier this year, I knew about machine learning. I knew about what happened in 2011 when deep learning started to work, when people realized that, yes, if you just bash it hard enough with enough rounds of training and so on, you can get that neural net, simple as it may be, to learn interesting things. And so similarly, makes one think, well, if we bash that genome hard enough and try enough mutations in the genome, maybe we can get it to produce interesting behavior that will produce a fit phenotype, so to speak. And turned out I found, yes, that is in fact the case. Even with very tiny genomes, so to speak, that might have like 30 elements in them, you're making just one change in one element at a time. And if that change leads you to a less fit organism, according to some criterion, you reject the change. If it leads to at least as fit an organism as you had before, you accept the change. And what I discovered, you can see the pictures, and I have a bunch of new pictures coming out in the next day or two, is that by doing that, by making those tiny changes in this genome, in this computational genome, you can get more and more elaborate phenotypes. And for example, if your fitness criterion is live as long as possible, run for as many steps as possible before all the cells turn to white, for example, then what you'll see is that you can indeed get the thing to live really quite a long time. How does it do it? Well, you look at the pictures and they look really complicated. There's another thing about them. They look very lifelike. They look very organic. They look very much like the kinds of things that one is used to seeing in in living organisms, which is kind of interesting. But what you also see is that as you go through successive stages in the adaptation process, you change from one genome to another, you get something that's fitter and fitter, you see that you get something where it sort of has an idea. It notices that you can make, a triangle with stripes in it. And then in the next round, it embellishes that, and it makes a stack of many triangles with stripes in them. And that's sort of any path of adaptive evolution. It kind of has ideas, and it progressively builds on those ideas. That's what you kind of qualitatively see. With different random choices of what mutation to make, you'll have a different set of ideas, and it will build up in a different way. And so that it really is quite reminiscent of what you see in the fossil record. Of first it had little legs, and then the legs got bigger, and then it got wings and a beak and whatever else. And you kind of see this gradual buildup of ideas into sort of more complex organisms, so to speak. And that's exactly what you see in this very simple model. But if you ask the question, where does sort of the baseline complexity of what's going on come from? It's an interesting computational origin. That is, according to natural selection and kind of the Darwinian story, it's like everything that we see must be sculpted by the effect of the environment and all those different organisms living and dying and so on. It must have all been sculpted in some way, not by the creator, so to speak, but by the progressive kind of imposition of the effects of the environment. What we're now seeing in this computational model is that most of that complexity is just because that's what computational systems do. It's mostly the result of computational irreducibility, just very simple rules, behavior that you can't readily predict except by running the steps and seeing what happens. What we see in biological evolution, it seems, is that we have a fitness criterion like live a long time, and there are these lumps of irreducible computation. And what we're doing is, by these mutations and so on, we're finding where is there a lump of irreducible computation that we can make use of to fit together to make the fitness that we're trying to achieve. And so, in other words, it's not the case that we're carefully sculpting every detail by requiring that fitness. Instead, it's just that fitness is an overall criterion, and then we're just finding, sort of lying around in the computational universe, these lumps of computational irreducibility that we can assemble in such a way as to make them achieve a certain fitness. So in a sense, the answer to sort of the question for Darwin of where does the complexity of biology come from is it's really of computational origin. It's computational irreducibility. And it isn't the case that these different possible paths of evolution would lead to the same complexity. They'll lead to complexity that is computationally equivalent, but in detail it will not be the same. And it is not in detail something that is serving specifically the criteria of being fit in the environment. Being fit in the environment is a very coarse kind of criterion relative to what's happening at this computational level. Actually, what turns out to happen in more detail is you can look in these models of mine, you can look in sort of at the full story of all the possible paths of evolution. And you can ask, well, how does the environment how does natural selection pick out a particular path out of all these possible paths? And the key idea is that the environment, natural selection, fitness functions, and so on are actually very coarse in picking out these different paths. So if you said, well, I'm insisting that I get this very specific pattern, well, that is hard to achieve with one of these fitness functions. You have to kind of drill in to get just that particular thing. What tends much more to happen is that you have a fitness function that's very coarse compared to all those computational details. And so there are many things that could satisfy this requirement, let's say, to live a long time or something, and essentially all of them will end up showing computational irreducibility, but still satisfying that particular coarse requirement. It's a very direct analog of things I've studied about observers and kind of the theory of observers in the ruliad and the entangled limit of all possible computations. And it turns out that one of the big discoveries in the last 5 years of ours is that sort of physics and mathematics are fundamentally derived from the same kind of ultimate computational object, the ruliad. And what we're now realizing is biology comes from the same thing. In the case of the ruliad and physics, observers like us are kind of taking slices through the ruliad that we identify as corresponding to things happening at successive moments of time and so on. In the case of biological evolution, the way that we're slicing the ruliad is a bit different and is based on these fitness functions and so on. But it is ultimately, again, what we're seeing in biology is, again, kind of a slice of the ruliad. And in a sense, that sort of shouldn't be surprising, because in biology, we're seeing this diversity of rules being used, different organisms, different rules, and so on. We're seeing different parts of the ruliad, so to speak, and we're seeing the particulars of what happened on Earth with the particular way that organisms that we happen to get is a particular slice that's like a particular observer of the ruliad. So, I mean, there are many other questions, like why does biological evolution not get stuck? Why is it the case that from any given place in this kind of space of possible rules, possible organisms, that there's always a way to get to a better place, so to speak, and that it isn't like, well, you've got to this basin in the space of possibilities, and there's no way you can get out of that basin, so to speak. You can't get to something you can't sort of go down the mountain, so to speak, because you're stuck in this kind of local basin. That doesn't happen is again a consequence of computational irreducibility, together with the fact that there are many different in a genome, for example, there are just many different places where mutations can happen, but even that is not enough to guarantee that you don't get stuck. And so that's kind of the other thing that comes out of these kinds of models. So there are a few things. I suspect that a great many phenomena that have been observed in biological evolution are visible in these models. One can plainly see a few of them. One of them is so-called punctuated equilibrium, that in the fossil record, for example, you see a lot of kind of organisms that kind of look the same for a long time, and then suddenly they change a lot. You see exactly the same phenomenon in these models, as an example. I mean, and there are no doubt other things like that, and it will be interesting to kind of inventory what those correspondences are between this very simple computational model and what's actually observed in biology. But I think that's the main thing, I suppose, is I think we finally have a decent answer to the question about sort of why is there complexity in biological organisms, and it's really a computational irreducibility story, and we can really see the trade-off between what is sculpted by natural selection and what is just intrinsic computational behavior. Let's see. Let's see. Questions here from Max about so the most successful organism is you and me, because we have the potential to organize and find solutions and so on. That I am not sure whether we're the most successful organism. I think we represent what is it? Humans, I think, are 40% of the mammalian biomass on this planet, which is shockingly large. But we're certainly not the majority of the biomass that's mostly in the oceans. I don't know how you count successful species. I mean, there are 8 billion of us, but there are a lot more. I think there are even in the US, I think there are 5 billion chickens. So we're not, I'm sure the total chicken count of the world is significantly higher. So we're not the most successful in terms of number of organisms. Are we the most successful in terms of transforming the planet? I'm not even sure about that. There are plenty of organisms that microorganisms that have done huge things to transform the planet. We, to ourselves, we seem like the most successful organisms because we're able to do all these cool things that we care about. It's hard to know what the ants and the whales and so on care about. So, in their eyes, they can perfectly well be the most successful organisms. So I think that's a tricky thing to claim. Let's see. Gosh, many questions here. Just think, let's see, Paula is asking, who created the first map? I don't know for sure. I've seen in like the British Museum, there are architectural plans from ancient Egypt that are on tablets and so on. I don't know whether people routinely were even making architectural plans in early antiquity. I think, I don't know whether by the time people were, for example, making battle plans and so on in Roman times, I don't know whether they had, the big table where they were moving little sort of toy armies around. I kind of suspect not. I suspect it was, all in the mind, so to speak. I think by the 1400s, 1500s, things like that, there definitely were maps. I'm trying to think where, well, another example, Ptolemy, first century AD, had his geography, and he had information on where places were in the world as he knew it at that time. And I think he had notions of latitude and longitude, which he had partly, I think, deduced because he'd been looking at the heavens, and he had a star catalog. I think, I don't know, 500 stars, maybe something like that, in his star catalog. It's long been a discussion whether he plagiarized his star catalog from Hipparchus, who lived 275 years earlier. And it's right on the edge of whether you can tell if he plagiarized it, because in 275 years, the nearby and fast-moving stars have moved a certain amount. And so they're in different positions. And the accuracy is not quite enough, I think, to be able to tell whether Ptolemy was actually reproducing a star catalog from 275 years earlier, or whether he really made his own. But he certainly knew of Hipparchus's catalog. But anyway, Ptolemy has his version of geography where he tried to find the positions of places on the Earth. So I don't know whether he drew the map, and I'm not sure we would necessarily know, because there's always a question of when people were copying kind of manuscripts and so on, what did they copy? What did they think was important? I mean, it could be the case that some manuscript might have had a wonderfully illuminated, form for some letter, but the next monk down the line who copied it, so to speak, just thought all we care about is the words. Now, I do know that in terms of sort of diagrammatic stuff, Euclid, for example, there are some not original manuscripts of Euclid, but fairly early manuscripts of Euclid that do contain geometrical diagrams, and those were, I think, successfully copied. So I don't know when, it's sort of a question of people could have said, well, the map is just kind of an accent thing. We don't need to copy that. All we need to copy is the words, because that was the way that things, unless they were on stone tablets or clay tablets or whatever that were baked in the sun, that's the way that one could get the material from those times. I think the question of maps coming into like the 1500s, 1600s, there started to be pretty decent maps. I mean, it's worth remembering. So let's see, by the time of Columbus, there must have been maps, and there must have been, famously, people knew the size of the Earth. People like Eratosthenes in antiquity knew the size of the Earth fairly accurately. But Columbus was kind of cheating it a bit, or maybe had a crazy theory, because he thought that you could cross the ocean sea, as he called it, from Europe and get all the way to China in a matter of, I don't know, maybe less than 2 months or something, before all the food ran out, so to speak. He sort of had a wrong theory of the size of the Earth, because if he had the correct theory and there wasn't, and the Americas weren't there, then he just wouldn't have made it across that expansive ocean in the time that he had food for and so on. But as it turned out, in 5 weeks or something, he got to America. But I think maps certainly existed at that time, and the maps that you see from even the 1600s, even the 1700s, are very distorted. I mean, but because it's really hard, you're going out, you are sort of going around a ship. Now, you would think that you would be measuring kind of lat long by measuring latitude and so on. But you could measure latitude fairly easily from the altitude of the sun. But measuring longitude is more difficult. And to really measure it properly, you need to know what time it is. And to know what time it is, you need to have a clock that's accurate and that doesn't lose its time as it's being buffeted around on your ship in the ocean. And that problem wasn't really solved until the 1700s, I guess. So, knowing really where you were was difficult. And so when people drew maps, they knew, well, there was a coastline here, but it could be awfully distorted the topology of the coastline was understood, but the precise position in terms of latitude, longitude was not. And so the maps tended to look quite distorted. I mean, a notable issue was I'm remembering here, I'm thinking there were certainly orreries for the heavens that were circular from antiquity, I think, and I'm wondering whether there were globes, but I don't think there were showing sort of the position of things on the Earth. But one of the issues was, how do you take the spherical Earth and show a two-dimensional picture on a piece of paper to make a map like that? And that was a question of map projections. And Mercator, for example, was famously one of the people who produced sort of a projection, a map projection. Map projections became kind of big in 1700s and then 1800s of trying to find how do you unroll the sphere to make it flat. And you could take something where you put a cylinder around the sphere and just project things from a line in the middle of the sphere. That's one way to make things to align things. Another thing is you can sort of try and unroll the sphere a bit. The Mercator projection, for example, makes things close to the poles bigger than they should be. It doesn't keep the areas the same. There are a whole bunch of different kinds of projections. And in fact, even coming into the mid-20th century, there was a lot of kind of what projection is the right projection to use. When I was a kid, at least, Mercator projections were by far the most common. And Mercator projections make, Canada and Greenland and so on look really huge. And so certainly the young me would have, if somebody said, how big is Greenland? I would have said it's really big, because that's what you saw in the map projection, so to speak. Even though on a globe in 3D, it was the correct size, so to speak. But there was a lot of kind of development of map projections and a certain amount of kind of political maneuvering, because certain map projections make some countries look really big and other countries look small and so on. And there's sort of a question of how you arrange things that way. I know, certainly talking of the history of these things, when I was a kid growing up in England, every map had every British Commonwealth country colored in pink. That was just a thing about maps. And, because, and conveniently, it also had the Greenwich meridian, the line, the 0 degrees longitude that goes through the Greenwich near London. That was always in the center of the map, as it is in many maps. But that was, it sort of all made sense if you were living in England, that England would be in the center of the map, so to speak. Let's see. It's a question about going back to biology from WW. Do you find morphological attractors in your simple models of biological evolution? There is evidence that morphospace might be like a hyporuliad. Okay. There are absolutely, when you make up, so the question is, what are the forms of animals? What are the forms of plants and animals? There are, and how rich is that space? And can you get any shape of plant and animal? That's a thing you might expect. If natural selection can sculpt anything, well, you could have things in any shape you want. There are definitely shapes that are easier to get. Even in these simple models, computational models, that's absolutely the case. By the time you're making things out of proteins and so on, it's even more the case. At least maybe it's actually not differently the case. Maybe it's a comparable thing. It's always interesting to know how plants and animals grow. I mean, famously, plants have rigid cell walls. So they have the feature that once they built a piece of themselves, they just get to add stuff on. They don't get to very much distort what's already there. We animals have the feature that we're kind of floppy, and something that grows somewhere can squash something else, and we can kind of expand that way. But so plants discover things like branching because that's a good way to sort of add stuff on without changing what's already there. For animals, we discover things like folding and so on, which is a convenient way to make features of us that works if you're kind of floppy. And I think that for any, I'm always curious when you see different forms in animals, particularly things which are very rigid. How did that thing grow? How did the sea urchin grow? How did the skull grow, and so on? And one has pretty good answers to many of those things. There's a question of sort of how much of morphospace, the space of possible forms, is actually filled by organisms. And I know the one case of mollusk shells that I happened to study a bunch many years ago, one can say that, yes, pretty much the whole space of possible shapes is filled with actual mollusks on the Earth. Those mollusks live in different environments. They kind of make use of their shape in different ways, but in the end, they kind of fill everything. Now, if you ask more generally, how would you characterize what possible shapes can you get? That's an interesting question. I think there isn't a particularly good way to characterize those kinds of things. You can make very coarse characterizations. And a thing I was just doing, I was just looking at the aspect ratio of height to width of things. The question of sort of, well, just describe the shapes you can get. Hard to describe shape space. Actually, to tell a personal sort of historical anecdote, back in 1978, when I was a kid, so to speak, it was a time when particle physics was really big, and people were making all kinds of discoveries in particle accelerators and so on, and I was sort of involved in that kind of thing. And there was a big question about the shapes of events. So you have a particle collision, let's say electron and positron crash into each other they sort of generate as much energy as the rest mass of 10 protons or something, 10 GeV. Well, what comes out after that collision is a whole bunch of particles. That might be 40, 50 particles come out, pions and muons and all kinds of different things. So the question is, they come out and they're in a certain shape. They could all come out more or less equally distributed around different directions, so kind of a spherical shape in effect. Well, they could come out very concentrated into kind of jets, let's say 2 different jets. You have to have momentum conservation. So things that go out one side, there has to be a compensating thing on the other side. So there's a question of how do you characterize the sort of shapes of events? And actually an effort of mine from, when was it? It must have been 1978, which still seems to be used today, are some things that get called Fox-Wolfram variables, which are kind of a way of characterizing those shapes. And the way those work is they're kind of saying, well, there are these mathematical functions, so-called spherical harmonics, which also happen to describe the shapes of atomic orbitals that go from sort of the spherical to the thing that's sort of a 2-lobed thing to the thing that's kind of a 3-lobed thing, a 4-lobed thing, and so on. And they describe those things mathematically in a way that's a little bit like saying, well, you've got a piece of string and you pluck it in the middle, and you can have a mode that has sort of 1 maximum. You can have another mode where it wiggles once in the middle, and you have 2 maxima, and so on. You have these different modes, and they're represented by trigonometric functions like sine and cosine. The analog of that in 3 dimensions is spherical harmonics, and you end up with these kind of different shapes for different modes of spherical harmonics, different well, in the case of atoms, it's different quantum numbers, but it's just different numbers that characterize the particular thing you're looking at. Like you can have sine x, you can have sine 2x, sine 3x, and so on. So you have YLM, the spherical harmonic with 2 parameters, L and M. And as you change those, you go from the sort of spherical thing to the thing with 2 lobes, 3 lobes, etc. So anyway, you can kind of characterize the shapes of things there by just sort of saying how much of the spherical, how much of the 2-lobed, how much of the this do you get? That's one way to characterize shapes. It's an interesting question how one best characterizes shapes that are more complicated. a black box way to do it is to use machine learning and to use, for example, well, you can use, for example, dimension reduction, where you say, I'm going to take this image and it's got all these pixels in it, and I'm going to just say that I'm going to reduce that image to something that I characterize as a list of, let's say, 50 numbers, or even just 2 numbers, so you can use those as coordinates on a page. Well, what machine learning does, one of the things in machine learning is that you can find sort of ways to make those vectors, ways to make those collections of numbers that have the property that 2 pictures that kind of look similar wind up having similar collections of numbers, roughly. The way that's done, by the way, it's not too hard to explain, is you train a neural net, for example, to go from, let's say, pictures of cats and dogs and 1,000 other different kinds of things. And you train it so that you set it up so that it will go, you give it a picture of a cat, it will, at the end of the network, it will produce the word cat. And that's all well and good. And you can keep going. And if it produces the word, dog instead, you kind of tweak the network and sort of change it so that it gets closer to producing the word cat. You can kind of iterate this loop because you can train the thing because you have data that says, oh, here are a billion pictures from the web, each one with a little caption associated with it. And you train the neural net to get so that it will correctly go from the picture to the caption, so to speak. Well, then the idea of making these kind of vectors that characterize images, for example, is you in that chain of things that happen inside the neural nets of going from one layer to the next layer to the next layer. At each layer, you're kind of doing operations on collections of numbers. But what if you cut it off right before you get to that last layer that's going to make the words cat and dog? Well, what you've got is the insides of the neural nets are lists of numbers. So then what you do is you just take that list of numbers and you say, this list of numbers characterizes my picture. I don't understand the list of numbers. It doesn't turn into something that I humanly recognize, like a word like cat or dog, but it's just a collection of numbers, but I can use that as an embedding vector, as a feature vector that sort of characterizes the pictures of cats and dogs. And so that's a way that you can sort of start to characterize, you can sort of have a black box way of saying, hey, this thing corresponds to these numbers. I did that for my little sort of artificially evolved critters. It's not terribly helpful. The kind of the layout in that kind of morphospace is somewhat correlated with the kind of historical, with the sort of tree of evolution, but not tremendously so. There's much more that could be studied there. Let's see. Asks, are LLMs disconnected from humans in the ruliad? What is the distance? In the ruliad, we think of sort of different minds as being at different points in the ruliad. They have a different sort of way of representing reality. We all have a different set of neuron firings that occur when we see a cat or a dog or whatever else. And those are all different representations of reality, so to speak. And a question would be sort of how far away is the representation of reality that an LLM has from the representation of reality that a human has? We don't know yet. My guess is not as far as you would think. And my guess is that an awful lot of phenomena that are characteristic of brains will already show up in LLMs. And there's sort of a very interesting opportunity, I think. There's sort of a question. Will we be able to get kind of a science of psychology that is LLM psychology, and will that then play into human psychology? And one of the challenges there is, well, let's say we want to scienceify psychology. What do we do? What kind of a thing can we say? I mean, we can certainly say there are certain characteristic patterns of types of mistakes that humans make, or at a very simple level, optical illusions that people see. We can also say in certain pathological situations, if the human does X, they're probably going to do Y as well. If they do this weird thing, then they probably do this other weird thing as well. Those tend to be, let's say, correlated. And my guess would be that many of those pathological psychology kinds of things will have direct correlates in neural nets. I mean, one that I already saw, I was looking at neural nets that generate images, and you set up a neural net, you train it with 5 billion images, then you tell it a cat in a party hat as a prompt, and it will produce a picture of a cat in a party hat. But then you take these numbers, the ones I was just mentioning, these feature vectors, these embedding vectors, and so on, you tweak those numbers a bit. And you say, well, what's near the cat in the party hat? Not quite the cat in the party hat, but what's near it in kind of the mind of the LLM? And the answer is you have sort of a cat island where the things really look like pictures of cats to a human. And then away from that cat island, you have things which the LLM thinks are like cats. We don't think they're like cats. They look just weird to us. And if you go beyond that and you say, okay, I've got this LLM, I've got this neural net, it's producing pictures of cats in party hats. Now you go and you start modifying the actual neural network that produces those pictures. So for example, in the case of a brain, it might be, oh, there was some terrible thing that happened, and there was a stroke in that part of the brain, and that produced a lesion there, and so on. Or there was some drug that acted on that part of the brain, or something like this. You're making changes to the neural net, and the question is, what is then the mental image, in effect, that the neural net produces when the neural net itself has been changed? And the answer is interesting. I mean, the cat gets distorted in weird ways, but some things are fairly systematic. Like, for example, if you simply take the neural net, and in a neural net, there are these weights that determine kind of the how much effect one layer of the neural net will have on the next layer of the neural net. Let's say you just pump up the weights, you just increase the numbers, you start adding 10%, 20%, et cetera, to the numbers. What's kind of bizarre is that the images you get, the mental images, they look like kind of what you would imagine it would look like when the mind of the neural net is blown. The cat starts getting puffy and distorted and green, and it just sort of eventually kind of blows up into a blaze of color and so on. It seems like it's the kind of thing which, when people describe kind of effects of drugs on brains and things, it's kind of seems a bit like what people describe there, which is kind of interesting. And I would be quite suspect that many of the kind of coarser effects on brains that one sort of describes psychologically will have correlates in what one can see in making kind of coarse changes to neural nets. Now, if you ask, well, what are the more fine-grained things that you can say in psychology? I think that's much more complicated, because I think we don't really know for psychology, for humans, we don't know what the questions to ask are. I mean, for humans, we can say, well, for example, we tend to remember, chunks, five chunks of information. If you give a phone number or something, or I don't know whether anybody even gives phone numbers anymore, but a number, a tracking number, I don't know what, a number, and you have to read it out somewhere. It is always convenient to break it into blocks of 3, 4, 5 numbers. If you try and read the whole thing as a coherent lump, it's much harder for our working memory to operate well and to deal with kind of communicating in that way. So that's a phenomenon. That may be a feature of the hardware of brains. It may be a feature of the particular way that kind of short-term memory works in human brains, or it may be something that is to do with information processing in a wide class of systems. I'm not sure. But that's an example of kind of a psychological fact, in a sense, about humans. It is a question, what would a theoretical model of psychology really look like? What would, and can one effectively, and then if one has such a concept of what it would look like, can one learn about it from neural nets? One feature of neural nets that's different from humans is if you try and do a psychology experiment on humans, it's very hard to make that experiment really repeatable, because, you say to a human, click the button when you see the flashing light here. Well, after the human's done that 10 times, they remember that they've done it. And you can't really erase that. Maybe you can try a different human, but it's all rather difficult. Whereas if you're dealing with a neural net on a computer, you can just say, reset the bits, just reset back to the beginning and try the experiment again. You can keep trying it over and over again, and you really do have something which can be repeatable. So that's a feature that is sort of a new feature of something that is, in a sense, human psychology-like, but but much more repeatable. When you go inside and you say, well, it's just a computer, we've got to be able to figure out what it does, that doesn't work out. It is a story of computational irreducibility, and it's a story of kind of things that got put together, these sort of lumps of irreducibility that got put together to achieve the objective of learning whatever you wanted it to learn. But if you say, well, can you explain why it works that way? Can you find a mechanism? Can you find a circuit? Those things are very difficult, as they are for neuroscience. And I think that's the question of the correspondence between sort of neuroscience and LLMs. My guess is that a lot of the large scale kind of features will be very similar. But then if you start saying, well, there's this special feature of human psychology. Like, for example, I don't know offhand, actually, whether a modern neural net sees any of the optical illusions that we see. I'm not sure. That's an easy experiment to try. Somebody should try that. And, you know, it could be that those optical illusions are mostly due to just, oh, you have only a limited number of cells of the retina and the visual cortex and so on. It could be, I mean, there's some that are very, very much hardware related. Like, for example, there's one, I looked at this when I was a kid, and I had a theory, which actually I think was more or less right. If you have a disk and it has black on one side and white on the other side, you spin the disk at a certain speed, you start seeing bands of color. And a reasonable theory, at least my childlike theory, was that the different kind of color receptors in the eye have different response times. And so, you know, a color receptor which responds really quickly will be sort of out of whack with one that responds more slowly in terms of when it's seeing black versus white. And so you'll see color develop just because of these time delays and so on. But that's an example of something that is deeply dependent, if that's the right explanation, on the hardware of our eyes and so on. And it's not something where it's an information architecture kind of issue. It's more of a detailed hardware issue. But you know, there's a question of what are the architectural features that will be in common between things like brains and LLMs. Let's see. Prutz is asking, an LLM's view of reality is mostly language and text, right? Yes, I mean, an LLM, its main mission tends to be the thing it is initially trained for is, here's this piece of text. You've seen a trillion words of examples. What will the next word typically be? But and the same kind of thing with images and so on. What will the caption associated with this image be? Those kinds of things. It's an interesting question to what extent it has a model of reality. It's an interesting question to what extent we have a model of reality. Certainly in the mid-20th century, there was a big trend of linguistic philosophy where people were saying the only things that you can ever think about are things that you can express in language. Language is the representation of thought. If that's true, then LLMs have it all, so to speak. If there is more to thinking than things which you can express in language, then LLMs sort of don't have it all. My own feeling is this, that there are sort of lots of neuron firings going on in our brains. They're very incoherent, even within our own brains, and certainly from brain to brain, they're very different. But if you want to package a thought, if you want to have something which is a transportable thought, you pretty much have to use language or something somewhat similar to language. And that's kind of oh, I've got this sort of set of neuron firings going on, which will eventually lead me to have this mental image or this thought, this linguistically definable thought. But that is at a sort of pre-linguistic level. But by the time it's a transportable thought that you could explain to anybody else, it is probably linguistic. And I think that's the role in which, that's kind of the sense in which thoughts are defined by language. Transportable thoughts are defined by language, even if there can be sort of the building up of thoughts that happens in some pre-linguistic level. And certainly we know plenty of examples in terms of the sort of hardware operation of the brain of where sort of we have things that happen even before we've sort of engaged at the language level. I mean, there are plenty of things, if you see a flash on one side, you'll tend to turn that way, and that happens at a level of brain processing that is much above the level at which you could ever describe what you saw. I have to tell a story. I might have told this before from 25 years ago, I think, in the history of Wolfram language and Mathematica and so on. We have this notebook technology that we developed 38 years ago now, where you can put, text and code and graphics and mathematical formulas and so on, all mixed together in these notebooks that are computable documents, and they're quite wonderful. And I guess people finally realized that they were a great thing. Our users had probably realized it for 3.5 decades, but more generally, maybe a decade ago. In any case, in that technology, one of the things that you have to confront is a very weird phenomenon. So when you type text into a word processor, you're used to every letter you type, the cursor moves forward one letter. But when you type a mathematical formula and you're occasionally making a built-up fraction, or you close a parenthesis and so on, the typeset form of that formula may be such that even though you typed a new character, the position of the cursor can move backwards, just because the thing reformats itself to be correct given what you now typed. So for a few years, people used to report it as a bug. They said, "Oh, the cursor moved backwards. I lost track of it. I don't know what's going on." So then we had this idea of making, we called it the giant shrinking blob, that was just a black blob that shows up at the position of the cursor, and in a few tens of milliseconds kind of compresses itself just into the shape of the cursor. But it starts as a pretty big black blob. So it turns out that the way that our brains work, the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is where the optic nerves cross over and so on in the brain, before you get to the visual cortex at the back of the brain, there is already some awareness of what you're seeing. And in particular, if there's a great big black blob, you pre-attentively, without thinking about it, you move your eyes to the position of that black blob. So when it comes to don't lose your place when you're typing, it's a big win, because you instinctively move your eyes to the position of that black blob. And as far as you're concerned, as you type, you're just keeping track of where the cursor is. You never think about it. It doesn't get into the level of thinking or describing with words or anything like that. Well, there was, at least for a long time, a steady flow of rare tech support sort of inquiries or complaints. What is that black blob that I see? Most people didn't report it because most people didn't notice it. But some small subpopulation, I don't know exactly what, people had, faster visual processing or something, and they were noticing this black blob. And we had to explain, well, it's there for your benefit, so to speak. It's not a bug. But it was sort of interesting that that was a thing which most people didn't describe it with words because they didn't even notice it. It was something that happened at a level of brain processing below the level where we start knowing that we formed thoughts. Let's see. Claw is commenting that their experience with art makes them guess that illusions tend to be more of a low-level hardware thing. They aren't much subject to qualia. That's interesting. I don't know. It's a thing, really interesting thing to find out what. I mean, I also there's a question I should know the answer to, and I don't, about LLMs. And well, you can ask LLMs a lot of kind of questions that you also ask people, like, pick a random number between 1 and 10. Okay, the LLM will typically say 7. So will people. But that's not surprising because the LLM has seen that in a zillion documents effectively. And so it's kind of learnt, oh, pick a random number between 1 and 10. Oh, most likely on the web, the answer people will write down is 7. So that's kind of an easy thing. There's also the question of, well, what's the personality of the LLM? That's a more interesting one. And in the ways that LLMs are trained, there's a reinforcement learning human feedback phase. And certainly in the early, training of ChatGPT, there were I think instructions like don't make it say anything controversial. And when you have, people who are, I don't know what, contractors in California or something like this, it was like, well, yeah, there are things that are not controversial to folks like that, that might be what counts as not controversial to folks like that is a particular set of things. And but in any case, there's a certain personality imprinted on the LLM, both by the average personality of the world as represented by documents on the web, and the slightly more specific personality of the people doing the reinforcement learning, human feedback, sort of commenting on the responses that the LLM gives. But insofar as you can kind of prompt an LLM to behave differently, it's an interesting thing to try and prompt the LLM to behave like a a person with a certain demographic set of characteristics. I mean, a sort of an easy hack is, talk like a pirate. I'm not a modern pirate. Talk like a movie pirate, so to speak, and then it will do a pretty good job of that. Exactly how that works in terms of how to think about what's going on there. Are you sort of diverting? Are you kind of organizing the LLM to sample that part of the LLM's kind of space that corresponds to pirate-like talking? It already knew that it could be a pirate. You just had to tell it to be a pirate. It kind of reminds me actually of kind of sort of Socrates and the theories of education and so on. Of is education, well, as the Latin for educare, I guess, for the word to lead out, like ex and then duco, to lead. I mean, it's like education is like pulling things out, so to speak. And that was sort of a theory that in some sense, everything is already in there. It's merely a question of sort of pulling the knowledge out of a brain that already knows everything. I don't think that theory is quite right, but it is interesting to realize, now that I think about it, that for an LLM, that really is the story. Insofar as you get the LLM to just be prompted to behave in a particular way, it's like it's all in there. You're just pulling it out in a particular way. Now, in reality, to make an LLM really powerful, you have to have it use tools like our fine technology that for doing kind of computational knowledge type things. And just like a human, it's got to go, do that computation, look up that fact, so to speak, compute that thing. And so that makes it a bit different from just pulling everything out, so to speak. It's not really all in there, but if you have a raw LLM, it really is the case that if you say talk like a pirate, you're really pulling out the pirate knowledge that it already had. A different situation, I guess, from humans, really, I think. I mean, again, the theory, back in the time of Socrates or something, that was a viable theory, that it was sort of all in there. All the thoughts you could have were already in there, and it was merely a question of pulling them out, so to speak. I tend to think that's not the right story, and that a lot of what we know is the result of things that we observe in the natural world or things that we compute. And those are things that we wouldn't naturally sort of have there or be able to store, but they're things that we have to learn from doing, so to speak. Let's see. A few more questions I can perhaps address. Oh boy, from Nuno. Do you think it's possible that the Egyptians could have had a basic light bulb? I think it's I don't even know what that means. I mean, the fact is that, fire is a good source of light. Putting fire in a piece of glass, certainly there was glass in antiquity, not very good glass, but there was glass. Putting sort of fire inside a glass, I could imagine that being done. Having the idea of an electrical system where you have electrical supply or a battery and heating a wire. I mean, after all, the light of an ordinary bulb is, in a sense, it is getting its light in the same way that fire gets its light. It's heating something up, and you're seeing the effect of photons being produced by a heated object. So in some sense, it is sort of fire, and what makes it a bulb? Does it have to be enclosed in glass? Well, one can imagine that happening. Obviously, in uh, if you have a fire that's burning, it's using oxygen, and when it's used up its oxygen, it's out. So unless the bulb has a hole at the bottom, you don't get to make the sort of fire be the producer of light. The question of electricity and what was known about electricity, certainly in antiquity, there were static electricity and so on was known. The idea of electricity in wires and the idea of conductors and so on, I think was really not known. I think it would be we would have. See, this is one of the things that's a good question often, is if there was an invention, would it be widely enough known? Would it have spread widely enough that we would find it archaeologically? I think, for example, in the what is it, Incan culture, I think they didn't have wheels except on toys. They had enough on toys that we found them. They presumably didn't have wheels on chariots or whatever else, because if they had them, they would have made enough of those things that they would have been archaeologically preserved and we would know about it. Now, this argument doesn't always work. So, for example, we know that the Antikythera device, the thing that was found in a shipwreck in 1900 from 2,000 years earlier, that is a little mechanical computer, but we only have one of it. You would have thought that given that mechanical computers must therefore have existed in antiquity, that they would have been popular enough that there would be zillions of them, and we would have found them long, long ago. But we didn't. We only have one example. So the question of what else was there that was invented but was rare enough that we just haven't found it yet is an interesting question. I tend to think some kinds of inventions would have spread widely enough, would inevitably have spread widely enough, that if they existed and we had anything from that culture, we would have found evidence of those inventions, and others perhaps not. I mean, honestly, I find it very surprising that there's only one computer for antiquity. And given that sort of the idea of computers, mechanical computers, have been invented. But so that kind of throws for a loop my general feeling, which would be that anything that's a sort of sufficiently big invention, there'd be lots of it. Now, I suppose sometimes you can say, well, there might be that it's a big invention, but it's really hard to make. So most of the time, it was not many of them got made, and we only got a few that survived. I mean, if you said, what about a giant flat screen television from the beginning of the 1990s? They existed, but they were very rare. It was hard to make them because they had manufacturing defects. And a manufacturing defect in a television is really obvious because there's a bunch of dead pixels. And until you can get rid of that, it's hard to really sell the thing as a working television. So if we looked archaeologically, we would find just a few. We said, when was the flat screen television invented? Well, we'd find not very many we probably wouldn't find examples from the beginning of the 90s, even though those existed, but they were rare. Let's see. Lucy asks, were there prominent researchers in ancient civilizations who often referred to things of the past, or were they mainly working based on new ideas and hypotheses? No, they knew about the past. They absolutely knew about earlier thinkers. They often knew very little about the people. They just knew, an idea, the idea of atomism, the idea of, I don't know, some mathematical idea from ancient Babylon. These things were definitely known. And in fact, there was, I would say, the corpus of knowledge gradually got bigger through people building on what had gone before. Sometimes there would be a particular form of writing, particularly in more philosophical oriented things, was a commentary on somebody. So, somebody would write their thing, and then somebody would write a commentary on the thing, and a commentary on the commentary, and so on. And so that was it was easier to take the original thing and then write a commentary than to say, I'm going to stand up my whole own set of ideas. So that was pretty common. I think the question of of how seriously did people take sort of things from the past, I think the answer is quite seriously. I think that whether it was in science or in more directly in things like religion, where there was a sacred book that was written at a certain time, and that was the thing that, you know, people looked back to for a long time in the future, and still today in many cases. But I think you know, that was not that was I think the more common thing in science, rather than the I've had a new idea today. It was let me reflect on the ideas of the past, so to speak. I mean, there are fields of study which have very different sort of timescales in terms of how far back they look. I mean, there are fields where, I don't know, in biomedical kinds of things, it's like the references that are more than 2 or 3 years old, nobody cares about those. It's and whereas in something like mathematics, there's a little bit longer chain because it's kind of like we're relying on a theorem from 1922 or something, and it's still the same theorem and it's still true. It wasn't overtaken by some new molecular assay or something in biology. In philosophy, it's kind of one of the longest timescale things. People are still arguing about things that Plato said or whatever else. It's kind of a 2,000 years and counting kind of story. And insofar as philosophy was the dominant form of kind of intellectual discourse in antiquity, for example, that was the kind of tradition that one could expect, the kind of rediscussing things that have already been discussed from the past, rather than just like the new, you know, only talk about the new. I will say that the notion of sort of progress and the notion of there is the new and the new is sort of, you know, overtakes the old is in some ways a modern notion. I mean, I think that in antiquity, there was not so much of that idea of progress. It was just like lives are lived and more lives are lived and things are the way they are. And, you know, the political winds might change and the empires might come and go, but in a sense, life is always the same. And the notion of kind of there is a flow of progress is, I think, a pretty modern notion. And I think it's very much driven by technology because, you know, it's like you look at the you know, older pictures and you see there are these cars in the picture, or there are you know, horses and carts in the picture, and you know, these cars of yeah, they must be early 1900s type cars or something. The technology is visibly different. Or sometimes, you know, the architecture, sometimes there are style things, you know, somebody has the weird mustache. Well, that was a thing that was only popular in that particular period of time. Or they're wearing the, you know, the elaborate cravat that was only popular at a certain time. But I think the idea of, I mean, the idea that there's sort of a flow of progress is a comparatively modern one, and I think is driven by technology and the fact that we do see a sort of flow of progress in technology, and sort of in the past, the idea that ideas could build on each other wasn't even clear. That's a thing of comparatively modern times, I think. It was rather like so and so had an idea, we can comment on that idea, we keep commenting on that idea, rather than, well, you know, this person had an idea, you know, Euclid had an idea, Archimedes had another idea, Diophantus had another idea, and they're building on each other. I don't think that was so much of the notion. I think that the notion of progressively building ideas, as I say, is much more modern. And the idea that, you know, I think by the time of Newton, you know, Newton's Principia, 1687, he's sort of building a bit on Galileo, but I think he mostly saw himself as building on Euclid. It wasn't like there were all the people who'd come in between, all the different developments. I don't think he so much thought of himself as, in fact, I even remember the introduction to Newton's Principia talks about the ancients and the moderns and so on, and really is reflecting all the way back to antiquity there. And I think this is you know, this whole question about do people, well, what is the rhythm of activity? And, you know, what does tend to happen in science, for example, is that there is a sense, there is too, there's a sense the new is the best. And what was in the past and what people thought about in the past, oh, that's not interesting anymore. I have to say, many of the things that I've been able to do are going back to sort of 100 years ago type questions that never got answered, where the field moved on and it built this kind of it smothered the original question with other kinds of things that were other things that you could have something to say about, but that other question is still there. It just hasn't been thought about for 100 years. And sometimes some of the more exciting things I get to be able to do are things where it's like it wasn't thought about for 100 years. People just thought it was too difficult. But actually, with the methods that we have today, you can start cracking things that were around 100 years ago. I mean, we were talking earlier about biological evolution. That's roughly a 150-year story. There's a lot of things in physics that we've been able to make really wonderful progress on that really are things that follow on from things that were being done roughly 100 years ago, and where sort of then people built towers on top of that, but they avoided some areas where there were difficulties 100 years ago, and they just built towers that didn't depend on those difficulties. But now we can actually go and address those difficulties, and that's a pretty exciting thing as far as I'm concerned. Let's see. A question from Des here. How much do ancient myths reflect technology, like Hephaestus making a giant rock-throwing android? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's. I remember when I was a kid, the nursery rhyme. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty. Oh my gosh, how does it go? And anyway, it goes. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Well, Humpty was a siege engine, I think, used in the siege of the city of Bath, if I remember correctly, during the English Civil War in the 1600s. And, so this turned into a nursery rhyme about some kind of thing that, would assemble itself on city walls and then probably got rebuffed and pushed down and then fell into pieces and so on. So I don't know the extent to which sort of things that were, I don't know, inventions and so on got repeated in myth. That's an interesting question. I mean, it's worth remembering that excuse me. I'm being reminded that the nursery rhyme Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. Yes, but anyway, it's worth remembering that in sort of Western culture, particularly the Greco-Roman type culture, there was sort of and subsequently Arab culture and so on, there was a tradition of writing things down. It's not obvious that culture, and there was similarly in Babylonian culture, there was such a tradition. But there are other cultures, Indian culture, for example, where that wasn't really a tradition, where things were passed down as oral traditions for 1,000 years, and where the difference between a myth and an oral tradition is a complicated one. I mean, when somebody wrote it down, put it, carved it in a tablet or something, you're locked into that particular statement. But when it's an oral tradition, it's just going, step by step. It's less clear how that sort of, how direct that becomes. And I think I think it is an interesting thing that things which sort of start off as a kind of a weird mythical kind of idea often do turn out to have a kind of a base reality. I mean, a famous one will be dinosaurs, where people were talking about dragons for a long time, and people had seen kind of presumably fossils in rocks, and what were these things, and then it's like, well, but nobody had really focused properly on systematically what is this. And I think one sees that a whole bunch. One certainly sees that in lots of things in the history of medicine and so on, where people had noticed things, noticed connections between things, but it was kind of just a whimsical, anecdotal thing. And only much later did it become something where people could nail it down and find sort of a scientific explanation of it. So I think that the what gets preserved in myth is sometimes absolutely a real thing, although it may have been distorted and kind of and modified along the way. But it's there are certain myths from antiquity where we still don't know. Famously, for example, Troy from the Iliad and so on, turned out to be a real place. Atlantis, we still don't really know. Was it just a thing that got talked about as a sample, I don't know, utopian society or whatever, or was it a real place that we'll eventually find archaeological evidence of? I have to say, in my guess is most things where there is a bunch of smoke, there'll be fire as well. In other words, most things where there's a lot of kind of, oh, it seems to be roughly this way, they'll turn out to be something real there. I mean, another example from experimental science is something like cold fusion, where there's enough little kind of funny phenomena and so on. There'll be something there in the end. Will it be precisely what people thought? Probably not. But it won't just be, oh, there's nothing there, I suspect. It's one of these things where you see, once you know what you're looking for, you can know this is precisely what to look for. We do exactly the right experiment. It doesn't matter whether the humidity level is this or whether it's at higher altitude or lower altitude. It doesn't matter what the magnetic fields in the area were, blah, 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 blah. You know how to control for all these things once you know what the thing is. But before you know what it is, you can't tell. I mean, it's like, for example, in many biomedical things, it's like, was it important that people were doing this or that thing? Oh, nobody noticed, nobody bothered to ask. Were the people, standing on one leg half the day, and that was why they ended up with some particular condition? It's because nobody asked, because nobody had a theory that would connect that to that. I mean, this is always a tricky thing in experiment versus theory, is like, what do you have to have a theory to know what experiment to do? But given a theory, you have a prejudice about what the answer from the experiment will be. But if you see something in the experiment that was something you absolutely didn't expect, one of the big challenges in doing good experimental science is to notice things which you didn't expect, because it's really hard to do. And too often, even when there are things that you do notice, you don't interpret them correctly because you have this theory about what's going on. You just ignore that part. I mean, some of the discoveries I've been able to make, people had seen the phenomena decades earlier, but they just ignored them. They were like, oh, it's just noise in our system, for example. Well, it isn't. It's actually something that's a really interesting phenomenon in its own right. It's probably more important than the phenomenon you originally thought you were studying, but they didn't have kind of a way of thinking about these things. And so it was just, to them, it's just like, oh, get rid of that. That's not what's relevant to us because we have this particular way of thinking about things. Well, let's see. I should probably so many interesting questions here. I noticed a comment back to Egyptian light bulbs. There's a hieroglyph that looks like a snake inside a light bulb. It may look to you like a snake inside a light bulb, but who knows what it looked like to the Egyptians, where they had, maybe it was a type of food that they served in I'm just making that up, but it's very hard to go across spans of time and know what particularly abstract kinds of things might be representing. I mean, my all-time good example of a bad example was the thing sent on the Voyager spacecraft, I guess. No, Pioneer spacecraft. That was this plaque that sort of represented, this spacecraft. Here's the sort of the ownership plaque or something for the spacecraft of this is where it came from and so on. And there's a way of designating distance that's based on these diagram of the two circles, and one has an arrow pointing up, I think, and one has an arrow pointing down. And that's supposed to represent the hyperfine transition of the hydrogen atom. But that is so deeply dependent on things about the particular mathematical formulation of quantum mechanics that we use that is to be completely incomprehensible. And it's not even clear that that would be in probably our own efforts recently in sort of understanding quantum mechanics. Once those have really worked their way through, I suspect that representation will look really hard to understand. And I think it's very hard to know what these things were. um, in that time. Yeah, I was talking about optical illusions. Somebody pointing out that there's a moire pattern on this shirt. Yeah, that's bad, isn't it? I should. It's probably just the wrong resolution, but of shirt to camera and so on. I remember back in the day, people always used to say, "Oh, you're going to be on television. You've got to wear a blue shirt with no pattern in it." And I was sometimes I didn't have a blue shirt with no pattern on it when sometime when was supposed to be on some television thing, and it was like they said, no, 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 it will turn into a moire pattern. And at some point, people stopped saying that. So I think that might have been when camera resolutions got good enough. But this is a particularly bad moire case. Well, okay, we should wrap up here. And thanks for asking lots of interesting questions. And I see many more that I didn't get to today. And I look forward to chatting with you all another time. Okay, thanks and bye for now.